Microsoft's strategy moving into the next generation is radically different from what we saw back in the, quite frankly, disastrous launch of the Xbox One. Under Don Matrick's leadership, well, where was the focus on games? We've talked about this extensively in the past, of course. The lack of a clear message, the more expensive system, and so many other issues just made the Xbox One quite frankly undesirable compared to the PlayStation 4 for many gamers. But Microsoft have turned things around considerably over the past few years, with Phil Spencer and his team having a much clearer vision, a focus on games. In a future video, we'll discuss more of this overarching strategy with Game Pass, xCloud, the focus on games, as well as the actual, of course, fundamental hardware itself. But for this video, as the title implies, I'd like to discuss Xbox's Lockhart system. The Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 are pretty simple to describe. They are high-performance gaming consoles, and while their approach does differ a little bit, in general they have many of the same fundamentals. A fast SSD, RDNA 2 based GPU, Zen 2 cores from AMD, and so on and so on. Yet Lockhart is very different. It's designed, well, to be a cheaper entry-level system. Ultimately, console designs balance several problems: design and size, power consumption and heat, price, availability, and of course the actual performance of the hardware as well. Lockhart does still offer many of the same features of its bigger brother. We have an RDNA 2 based GPU, albeit with some cuts, we'll discuss that further in a moment, a Zen 2 based CPU, and of course the SSD.
So Lockhart is a rather different approach then, because we have most of the same technology present as the Xbox Series X, such as the SSD technology, a Zen 2 based CPU, a GPU sporting RDNA 2, along with all of its accompanying features, but the hardware performance has seen significant cuts, particularly the GPU. This two SKU strategy is similar to Sony and Microsoft and how they chose to close out this generation, with the PS4 and PS4 Pro from Sony, and the Xbox One S and the Xbox One X from Microsoft. Customers can choose based upon their budgets, what TV they have, and other needs. Do you need just a cheap way to play The Last of Us 2 and Ghost of Tsushima? Fine, PS4 base model then. Do you want a second Xbox for another screen in your home, perhaps serving more the entertainment role? Well, great, here's a good deal on an Xbox One S then. For this video, I do want to go into the specs, although they've not been officially confirmed, so I will do an updated video going into a full breakdown of those. But I also want to discuss why the Xbox Series X will not be held back by the Series S, aka Lockhart. As I mentioned a moment ago, Lockhart is very close spec-wise in several key areas to the Series X, albeit this version of the Xbox significantly cuts back on GPU performance. According to multiple reports, Microsoft are aiming for this system to be either 1080p or 1440p capable, albeit with the later running at only 30 FPS.
The CPU of the Xbox Series X as well as Xbox Lockhart is said to be identical. So 3600 MHz with SMT enabled, so that's 8 cores, 16 threads, or 3.8 GHz with SMT disabled, meaning just 8 threads. Now, a lot of folks will ask, well, why would you want to disable the additional threads? What benefit is there to do that? And really, it comes down to developers. Many times, developers don't get that long with a console to kind of develop the next generation of games before it launches. It's often typical that they'll only get like 12 months, for example. So to do a major rewrite of a game engine can be rather difficult. So according to Microsoft themselves, they believe that a really good strategy is to just allow developers to easily port code from their working game engine over to the Xbox Series X, with 8 threads, but then have a slightly higher clock frequency. That isn't to say, though, that certain developers at the launch will not take advantage of those 16 threads, but it will be really down to games developers to choose which approach is best for them. With the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, there were only 8 Jaguar cores, with, well, technically 6.5-ish of those being available for games developers. So therefore it's extremely easy for a developer to simply port over a working game engine from the Xbox One to the Xbox Series X or Lockhart.
According to Tom Warren from The Verge, we're looking at a GPU sporting 20 RDNA 2 based compute units, although we are missing several key specs for the GPU. The most obvious missing fact is the clock frequency, or if the 20 compute units is the total number of active dies on the GPU, or if the 20 number is the total number of active compute units on the GPU, or if it's the total number of compute units on the GPU itself, with Microsoft disabling, let's say, 2 of them, leaving only 18. If I had to take a guess, and it is a guess, I would imagine Tom Warren would be reporting on the number of active dies, since reporting the total number, including inactive dies, wouldn't really make much sense. This means that likely there are either 22 or 24 compute units on the silicon itself, with Microsoft disabling 2 or 4 of them, depending, for yields. The number of TMU is actually pretty damn easy to figure out. There's 4 TMU per compute unit for RDNA based architectures, and this doesn't appear to have been changed for RDNA 2. So you can do 20 times 4, which leaves 80 TMU, assuming, once again, Lockhart really does have 20 compute units. According to multiple reports, the Xbox Lockhart GPU is said to be over 4 T-flops. This to me means between 4 to 4.5-ish at the top end. Assuming the GPU clock is the same as the Xbox Series X, it means that Lockhart sports 4.6 T-flops. That's probably a bit high, but you can see some other performance numbers based on different clocks thrown on screen. We also have no idea as to the number of ROPs on the GPU.
From the GitHub leaks, the Xbox Series X's GPU contains 64 ROPs.
If I had to take a wild guess, I would say that 32 ROPs makes sense. This is, once again, not confirmed, but given we have the RX 5500 XT, which, yes, is RDNA 1 based, but still has a similar number of compute units, and the fact that it's only rendering at 1080p, I don't think 64 would make any lick of sense, and having fewer than 32 would probably be holding back the performance of the machine. As for RAM, apparently 7.5GB is usable for games, which leaves a ton of questions as to the total amount of RAM as well as bandwidth. There have been some rumours that the machine has 12GB total, but that would actually mean 4.5GB is not usable, in other words reserved for the OS, so that 12GB number, assuming Tom's figure of 7.5GB being usable for games, would be a bit too high. This means that the final config has either 11 or 10GB, but there's just so many questions as to the clock frequencies and also the amount of memory. It's very difficult to give really any meaningful analysis here. We're just missing too many key variables. But I want to focus on the quantity of RAM for a moment rather than its performance. After all, I see a lot of concern that 7.5 gigs is just not much. After all, compared to the 13GB-ish of the Xbox Series X and how much it gives to developers, the remaining 3GB of the 16, of course, is reserved for OS. Well, yeah, it does seem like it's a bit low, but this is where things get trickier. The lower output resolution of the GPU, let's say a target of 1080p, allows for way lower texture quality, and Lockhart can use lower quality textures, and it won't be noticeable on the lower resolution screen output. This is also on top of reduced overall quality of assets, because small amounts of detail won't be visible thanks to the lower resolution. Let's go back to the Road to PS5 event for a moment. Cerny mentions that he suspects there's about 2 seconds of gameplay in the PS5's RAM. And while, yes, the Series X and PS5 are created a bit differently, honestly, the Xbox will have a similar approach. Vast amounts of texture data, geometry, audio assets and so on are pulled into RAM as needed. And long story short, we have technology like Microsoft's sampler feedback, which allows only select parts of textures to be pulled into RAM, granular detail then, allowing for massive amounts of memory to be saved. A lot more space in RAM is also dedicated to streaming assets, i.e., a reserved portion of space where data is being pulled from the disk into memory. This is not a fixed amount that Microsoft provides developers, instead it is down to developers. Some games may only have 1 GB of streaming assets, while others may choose to have up to half of the memory being for streaming assets. This basically means that data is pulled into memory, it's quickly used and then overwritten with new data. And yes, this is keeping things pretty simplified. For the GPU performance, this is where things get quite interesting. Roughly speaking, the GPU in T-flop measurements is only about a third as capable of the Xbox Series X, but as we've discussed a million times now, T-flops are certainly not the only measurement in performance that we have to take into account. A huge saving is being made by running the game simply at a lower resolution. Check out the differences here between 1080p, 1440p and 4K on an RTX 2080 Ti. Thanks, by the way, to our Patreons for helping fund this purchase. Indeed, at 1080p, the 2080 Ti is often CPU bound. This means that the GPU is not being fully utilised because either the CPU is not clocked fast enough, or, more likely, the game engine is just not super optimized for tons of threads and is basically losing performance because of this, holding back the GPU frame rate. Either way, my point is, next-gen games will follow a similar principle. Lower resolutions dramatically reduces the work for the graphics. For starters, the number of pixels is reduced significantly. In a raw 1080p output, you're seeing about 2 million pixels on screen, but this balloons to over 8 million at 4K. But this is of course native resolution. AI upsampling and other techs such as temporal reconstruction can be used to render at lower quality resolutions internally and then enhance them to whatever output resolution you're aiming for. But while Lockhart does have this technology with machine learning at lower precision operations, I want to keep things as simple as possible here because after all, the Xbox Series X can also use AI upsampling, so I want to just focus on raw input resolution for a moment. Geometry work also sees a cut too, with fewer pixels to render because otherwise you would start having several triangles all come together in one pixel on screen, which would obviously be useless. This means objects at further distances can have lower detail too in many cases. And also, this translates to compute-based work. Then of course there's culling and performance-saving measures. These can be used more liberally compared to a higher resolution, as given that there are more triangles which will once again wander into the sub-pixel territory, you also have a lower resolution count, which means you can even shade the scene at a lower resolution and lose less perceived detail. And we've also discussed ray tracing lots of times in the past, but long story short, the Xbox Lockhart will still support hardware-based ray tracing. Remember that the GPU has acceleration for triangle/ray intersection testing, i.e. what stuff do those rays intersect with. This is what the Microsoft engineers, when being interviewed, said that you would need around 13 T-flops of performance on a second GPU to basically perform the same task if it was done in software. In other words, if you were running this on the GPU without the RT cores being present, you would need about 13 T-flops of performance just to hit the same performance targets, on top of course, the 12.1 T-flop Xbox Series X GPU, which is already present. So, While the BVH calculations, or triangle intersect testing, is being done on RT cores, the rest of the work in terms of shading is still being run on the compute units of Lockhart, but because the resolution is lower, it means there's less work anyway. Lockhart should not hold back the Series X much, if at all in my opinion. Indeed, I am likely guessing the workload to optimize Lockhart isn't too big of a deal, particularly given the Xbox Series X and Series S/Lockhart support the same SSD and CPU. The same CPU means the game engine is directly portable. You don't need to worry about, say, two entirely different frame rates or drastically changing world detail because the CPU can't handle it. Hypothetically, if Lockhart's CPU is only 4 cores, or ran at, let's say, 2.5 GHz, then this would be a way bigger concern than the GPU. I suspect that Lockhart will make up for the additional cost incurred for developers as well as Microsoft. Microsoft want as many people in their ecosystem as possible, purchasing games, having Game Pass, and of course, all of this means that there's a greater likelihood that you'll buy a game for the Xbox from Activision, EA, or whomever else. And this, to me, is a very good thing for Microsoft. In my opinion, Lockhart is going to be super interesting because of the alleged tiny form factor. Because of the lower performance GPU, reduced cooling as needed, smaller power supply, so on, a $200 to $250 console would be potentially fantastic in terms of value. And also, in a few years' time, would be an excellent candidate for a 5nm die shrink to form the basis of a portable console, or perhaps reusing the same APU structure for either a Surface tablet or other type of device with Xbox apps on board.
It's also going to be interesting to see if Lockhart ends up as just being a diskless console, or whether there'll be two SKUs, similar to what we've seen with the PlayStation 5. For example, we could see $219 for the all-digital Lockhart, and $249 if you wish to purchase a version with the disc. Arguably, trying to sell the console at the cheapest price possible does make an awful lot of sense. But, as I'm sure you're aware, not everyone has access to the fastest internet, or potentially will have bandwidth caps. Not to mention, some folks do still prefer to buy the physical version of games. So Microsoft offering two distinct SKUs for a home console does still make sense, but I guess it's going to depend going forward, because having 3 potential systems on the market may end up confusing customers. I know many folks are not interested in Lockhart because they say, well, I've got a 4K TV. Why would I buy a 1080p or even 1440p capable console? I would want to jump into the next generation with the most powerful system available. And I totally agree, Lockhart is not for everyone, and Microsoft knows this, but similarly, the PlayStation 5 isn't for everyone, the Xbox Series X isn't for everyone, and Microsoft, in my opinion anyway, just want to make as many different product offerings as possible. Remember, the old adage with Microsoft is true. They do not necessarily want to sell you one specific SKU. Instead, they want to get you into their ecosystem. So having a cheaper console, let's say $250, and then having you take out services like Xbox Live, Game Pass, purchasing games, and so on, is probably much more important to them compared to making a few extra bucks on a console up front. There's also the question with Lockhart, what happens with the Xbox One? Will we see a Xbox One and Xbox Series S, I guess we can call it, sitting on store shelves simultaneously, or will Microsoft make the Xbox One X become end of line and basically heavily discount the system, with the Xbox Series S, or Lockhart, basically replacing it in terms of pricing? It's going to be very interesting to see how all of this happens, especially given, let's say, that Microsoft choose for, let's say, 6 to 12 months to sell the Xbox One X, as well as the Xbox Series S or Lockhart, simultaneously, if there's only like a $50 price difference, for example, between those two systems, in my opinion anyway, it's going to be a very hard sell to convince anyone to purchase the Xbox One X. Ultimately, having backwards compatibility on both the PlayStation 5 for the PS4 and the Xbox Series consoles with just about everything does mean it's going to be even harder to convince users to buy the last generation hardware. It's going to be, well, a very curious generation, I suspect. With all of that said though, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. The normal stuff if you did: like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.